First of all, I'd like to thank Joe very much for that enlightening presentation. Joe was actually my PhD supervisor in the early 1990s, and as always, I really admire his breadth of knowledge and vision, and it's great to be collaborating together on something, again, that's so important. And Don, thank you for your engaging and educational presentation. Some of those theories I wasn't aware of before. Yeah, really interested in your assessment of how direct experience can affect our beliefs, but also the role that fear and concern can play in leading to motivation. And I'd like to pick up where you left off on that ground. But first of all, I'd like to actually start with a personal story, and it's not actually about climate change. It's a family story that my father tells, which was one of when I was 3 years old. He took me to the London Natural History Museum to see this model of the blue whale, the largest mammal on the planet. And on our way back home on the London Underground, we were sort of chatting away, and he was wondering why I hadn't actually mentioned this experience of the whale, because he thought I was actually going to be quite impressed by it. And I looked up at him and I said, it's too big to talk about. At which point the conversation ended, as my father was suitably chastened by the wisdom of a 3-year-old. So that's the place where I'd like to start. My presentation is called Too Big to Talk About: The Importance of Giving Voice to Direct Experiences of Climate Change. So I think some of the key messages that I draw from Joe's presentation is essentially that climate change is a source of concern for many Australians, and that the direct experience of events attributed to climate change produces strong emotions. And some of these emotions are very uncomfortable feelings, such as sadness, grief, fear and concern, hopelessness, frustration and anger. And there are some other ones, some more positive ones, of realisation and motivation. These emotions, these strong feelings, however, if unacknowledged and unexpressed, can actually have the capacity to cause anxiety and depression, avoidance and denial, the inability to think clearly about how to respond, a kind of a freezing in the headlights of an oncoming car or the roar of a predator. So the quotations that Joe read out, they're very familiar to me in my experience as a facilitator of experiential workshops, organisational change, and as a university educator. And the final model that Joe put up in his presentation with the central role that distress plays, and this corresponds to what Don was talking about with the fear appeal model, and it was that basically the distress, if acknowledged and expressed and processed effectively, can be a powerful motivator. As Don was saying, if an intervention can take place where a feeling of self-efficacy is introduced, then it can be a powerful experience. Otherwise, it can actually be a negative experience for people. So, getting back to climate change being difficult for people to talk about. This is for a few reasons, some of which Joe talked about. First of all, many of the events are geographically distant from ourselves, and the sorts of changes that have been occurring are slow changes, so difficult to detect. The environment, the climatic changes are like a background in our life, not necessarily the focus. Now, both of these elements are actually overcome by having direct experiences of climate change. However, we're still talking about large, complex systems. So the climate, weather systems, the problems that we're experiencing, they're hard for ordinary people to understand. We don't have that sort of scientific knowledge. So again, it's difficult to talk about in that way. But also the solutions that we're looking at, they're also large and complex. We kind of know that doing things on an individual level isn't going to be enough. We actually need to make large changes to our systems, to our governments, to our economic systems. So therefore, again, it's things that most of us don't really know a lot about. Difficult to talk about. However, I think the most important reason why climate change is difficult to talk about is because it elicits strong feelings. And as we know, our culture in general isn't that comfortable talking about strong feelings, especially strong negative feelings. We're told to lighten up a bit, focus on the positive, especially if we're wanting to create change in the world. The other reason that climate change can be difficult to talk about is because, and this is mentioned in Joe's draft paper, is that the discussion is set within a polarised debate. And this is often fostered by mainstream media and maybe even potentially by simplistic polls. The question becomes, is climate change happening or not? Is it human-induced or not? If we're to have healthy discussions, which helps people helps people to make sense of climate change and psychologically integrate that meaning, those conversations might start with the questions, how are you feeling about climate change? Or what can we do about it? How can we respond to it? So, based on my experience as a practitioner, and as backed up by a large quantity of eco-psychological practice and literature, it's vitally important that we address the psychological and social distress that climate change, our experiences of climate change are causing, and also, of course, to motivate action for adaptation to and amelioration of climate change. So basically, we need to create appropriate social spaces in which people can adequately make sense of and emotionally process their encounters with climate change and transform them into personal and collective action. So my reading of Joe's paper, particularly the tables, complex tables with all the different climate change variables and the correlations between them, is that there appear to be 3 associated factors that could function as independent or causal variables, one of which is the direct encounter with climate change, or otherwise meaning the attribution of weather changes or extreme events to climate change. Secondly, objective knowledge about climate change, and thirdly, the acceptance of or belief in the existence of climate change. So all of these things really ought to be integrated into these social spaces of making sense of climate change. Another aspect is that this process of making sense of understanding climate change is a social process involving our thoughts and feelings and imagination, other people, significant others, including family, friends, workmates, and of course the stories, media representation and cultural products. So the good news is that there's a raft of techniques which already exist, which have been developed by a grassroots movement over the past 30 years and now by the emerging fields of eco-psychology and ecotherapy. So they have their roots in the encounter groups of the 1960s and 1970s, but then they were further developed in the 1980s as a response to the sort of psychic numbing of the nuclear crisis and then the broader ecological crisis. So they've predominantly taken the form of experiential workshops originally called Despair and Empowerment, Deep Ecology, and now The Work That Reconnects. And these processes have been vastly refined over that time. So Joanna Macy is a key figure in this movement, and there's actually thousands of people across the the planet who've been trained up to facilitate these processes. And her latest book called Active Hope, last year written by Joanna and Chris Johnson, is full of really useful and accessible processes in this regard. So in Australia, this sort of work includes the Be the Change group running Awakening the Dreamer symposiums, Ausgreen's Youth Lead, Leading with the Heart, Rainforest Information Centres, Climate Change, Despair and Empowerment, Transition Town Movements, Heart and Soul groups, and our work at Sustainable Futures Australia and the School for International Training. So from an eco-psychological perspective, these processes assist people to deal with what's variously known as eco-anxiety, stages of awakening, the end of suburbia moment, which are all seen from within the context of this work as a healthy but distressing psychological response to what's currently happening on the planet. So I'll just run through these briefly, but these are, when I've analysed all of these different workshops and processes, these are the 5 key elements that they all involve. Firstly, there is the creation of a non-ordinary social space where the usual processes of debate, social comparison, emotional suppression are suspended as best as possible. Secondly, there's an opportunity for expressing strong thoughts and feelings about the state of the world. These emotions are validated as being normal and having value for positive change. Then importantly, there's some kind of visioning or intention setting, either on an individual or a collective level, for positive alternatives, and action planning is undertaken. And this comes with it, this is facilitated within a systems perspective. So some of these processes involve technical educational support, educational material, videos, lectures, technical experts. Others rely solely on the personal experience of participants. So a key message that is embedded in all of these processes is that a successful outcome, in other words, the adaptation to or amelioration of climate change, is not necessary for a meaningful and joyful life. Being together and taking action is what is important. This is what's known as active hope. So as Fiona Kem-Leiper of Be the Change wrote to me today, who's sitting here in the audience, she said, "The Awakening the Dreamer Symposium aims to leave people with the experience of interconnection, of community, of shared belonging and experience. That's where the whole thing is heading. We are not separate. We are not separate. We are connected, and that is where our power lies, in our connection to the earth and to each other." So examples of the different forms that these processes can take range from completing unfinished sentences in the private, such as, "When I think about the condition of our world, I would say things are getting ... That can be done in the privacy of one's own notebook or shared with another person or in a circle of people. Second process is engaging with video footage at a feeling level. So as we were talking, the distinction between direct experience and mediated is not that important in this context. Other forms include small group conversations or sharing circles that don't take the form of debate but involve listening completely to each other's thoughts and feelings, and ritual forms for expressing deep emotion, including processes called the truth mandala, but also techniques that are more suitable for a corporate or mainstream audience, including whiteboard brainstorming of hopes and fears. So it doesn't really matter. What's really important, of course, is for creating safety for emotional expression means that you need to have a subculturally appropriate setting, and there's a lot of other factors that are important, but I'll run through those. So, have any formal evaluations been done on this kind of work? There have been some. My PhD research focused on this, and basically I found that some key outcomes of these workshops were that people felt that they were not alone in being concerned and being motivated to solve the environmental problems, and they felt empowered. At Sustainable Futures Australia, we've found that the strategic action plans for sustainability that we've used these techniques to build have been incredibly successful in terms of actually achieving on-ground outcomes rather than just being reports on a shelf. The direction of the university students from the environmental action course has been profoundly altered by these processes. There's been analyses within the eco-psychology movement of how these workshops operate. And lastly, a study by a student of mine, Luke Terrell, last year, he did an analysis of the Awakening the Dreamer symposium and found positive emotions and self-efficacy as to being the greatest outcomes of that. So this is just an example from the online survey of about just 100 participants in several of the different symposiums. And basically what you can see, I hope, from that is the difference between before and after the workshops. If you take out, most people before and after describe themselves as feeling motivated in terms of the ecological crisis. What you see is a decrease in the negative emotions that people were feeling and an increase in the positive emotions. So lastly, the reasons why I think that it's important that why these group processes are important rather than an individual kind of eco-therapy perspective is important, is firstly that the process of making sense of climate change is an active social process. So we need to support each other, both emotionally and increasingly physically, as the impacts of climate change progress. And thirdly, the solutions are collective and systemic as we reorganise ourselves towards a post-carbon future. So we need to come together in our feelings and in our planning processes. So I'd like to finish, if I've got time, with a 2-minute video, which is rather poignant. It's taken by my husband Peter this Monday in a suburb of Byron Bay. And I'd like you to watch as this solitary figure braves the massive storm to inspect the flimsy protection against the storm surges on the beach. And I'd like you to ask the question, how can we best support each other to face and respond to our encounter with climate change?